We're looking forward to the session today. Thanks for joining us. My name's Tahmassebi. I'm the People Science Director here at WorkBuzz, which is just a fancy way of saying that I'm an occupational psychologist, really, which in itself is just a fancy way of saying that I enjoy researching all things employee engagement, culture and performance, really interested in what drives human behavior and motivation in the workplace. Been fortunate enough to do this now for a number of years, probably 15 years or so now, with organizations across all different sectors of different sizes and geographies as well. But what I really believe in is that we all deserve to enjoy our work no matter what we do and where we do it. I'm also very aware, given all of the work I've done within the research space, that we are in the autumn season, which is often when organizations look to run their big employee surveys or to do a pulse survey before we get towards the Christmas period. And so the purpose of this session today really is to see if it sparks a little bit of thought or some interest in how you might approach your employee research in a slightly different way. So that might be some surveying you have in the pipeline to come up in the near future, or it might be that you've recently gone through a survey with your colleagues and you're having a look at the year-on-year trending, seeing what's changed and starting to think about what it is that you might be able to do with colleagues in the future. And hopefully this webinar just provokes some thought around that and gives you some ideas of what you can do to breathe some fresh life into your colleagues' survey. And so I mentioned the word culture there when talking about research, and that is going to be the real kind of focus of what we talk about today, because I love this kind of idea of really simply talking about culture within inside organizations. As culture is either the hero or the villain for any organization anywhere, no matter what it is that they do. The organizations that achieve really great things do it on the back of or because of the fact that they have a really strong culture within their organization, and it's that really strong culture that drives the performance, the innovation, whatever it is that organization is trying to achieve. And also on the other side of that, culture is often the thing that keeps us out of trouble as organizations. So whether that's keeping us out of trouble with the regulator, whether that's making sure that we achieve a really strong health and safety performance, it all again stems from having a really strong culture in place. And I'm not going to name names of any particular organizations, but I'm sure for anyone on the call here, through your experience as practitioners, you'll have heard many different stories of different types of organizations across all different sectors that have gone into the press for the wrong reasons, whether that be in the aviation industry, where it's well reported when there are incidents within that particular industry, whether it's in telecoms or it's in government organizations, whether it's retail and hospitality, financial services. There's a number of organizations that have found themselves outed in the press almost for things that all stem back to the culture that they have in place, and often toxicity within the culture. And that's really why we need to be thinking more about whether we're truly measuring culture. And because culture is driven by behaviors, primarily it's about how we show up and how we behave on a day-to-day basis. Are we really measuring behaviors enough through what we do within our surveys? And that's the real kind of reflection point, I think, for all of us when we start thinking about the surveys we've done, the surveys that we have coming up, is are we really getting to the heart of culture and how people behave and the different behaviors that are role modeled on a day-to-day basis when we do these pockets of research. So what you might see typically when you do reporting, and that's whether you do that type of surveying activity with the likes of ourselves at WorkBuzz or wherever you might do it, you'll often see typical reporting like this. This will be how you traditionally look at your data, the first questions that you'll be asked by leadership teams in terms of reporting back what's happened in the survey. It'll typically be participation rates. It will be how engaged are our colleagues and how does that compare to the last time that we ran the survey? How does it compare to benchmarking? And that's absolutely okay. And we will continue to do that as organizations. We want to get an idea of how we benchmark externally. We want to get an idea of whether we're making progress, both at the organizational level and within specific parts of our business. But the real question that it begs is, do we get enough from this type of reporting to really help us drive change, to drive true cultural change that can wholeheartedly influence and impact something like the engagement of our colleagues? So typically when we get this type of survey reporting, we'll get an idea of not only how engaged are our colleagues, but we'll get an idea of how they've scored around different aspects of their day-to-day experience, whether it be comms or something to do with ED&I, well-being, leadership, all of those typical themes that we'll cover. But often I hear a sticking point from practitioners is that year on year, or pulse after pulse, they really struggle to actually introduce actions or do something off the back of a survey that is so meaningful that it really does have a true tangible impact on colleagues. And often that's because a lot of the questions that we're asking are purely sentiment-based. We're asking colleagues just for their opinion on how they feel about certain things. And naturally, we're then trying to find what actions we can introduce and implement that will try and move the dial a little bit. And when it comes to things like communications or ED&I, which I use the examples of, 9 times out of 10, the thing that's really going to influence those things are going to be behaviors, things that really need to be seen and felt on a day-to-day basis for each individual in their role. Communications, it's often not about the channels we use, it's about how we convey messages and how we demonstrate empathy and how we really listen and make sure that communication isn't just one way, for example. Well-being is the same. Many years and decades now have gone where we've tried to introduce different well-being initiatives and activities, but really that boost to well-being comes from the day-to-day support and behaviorally how we show up and help support one another as colleagues, or if we're managers, those who work within our teams. And so what we recommend and what we've been doing with lots of organizations is balancing some of this sentiment-based questioning and research methodology with some more cultural focused, behavioral focused insight to try and pull the two together to provide a much richer picture and story for leaders and managers within organizations. So one simple way of doing this, you could do this in a survey that you run, is to just ask people, what behaviors do you tend to see most regularly on a day-to-day basis? So think about your everyday in the workplace. What are the behaviors that you most regularly see? Really trying to get an idea of what the lived culture might look like inside an organization. And what that can do in terms of your reporting immediately is it can give you another kind of at a glance view of what's happening across the whole organization, but not necessarily in terms of sentiment or rating around different aspects of the colleague experience. It's about how people are actually experiencing the culture on a day-to-day basis. So you can immediately get an idea of whether people are talking about the culture in a more positive way or a more negative way. Or you can start to have a look at through the lens of different demographics and get an idea of where particular words or particular aspects and behaviors are being seen more often than in others. You could map your values or behaviors that you expect to see in the workplace to this to see where there is the strongest overlap or where there are the biggest outliers, where are the pockets in the organization where you see more negativity than you would perhaps expect to see. The research tends to suggest that for anything that's over 30%, that would be considered a core element of your organizational culture, the kind of thing that if you picked me up and just popped me in one part of your organization for a day, I would probably walk away talking about and using that word to describe the behaviors that I saw, the culture that I felt. If it's between 20 or 30%, it's something that might be evident within your culture, but only within particular parts. So it's going to be really powerful to start to get that understanding of your organization. But where it gets really powerful is when you start to combine it with other data as well. So yes, you can have a look and filter how people are talking about the culture by different demographics, but you can also get an understanding of culturally, what does it actually mean to have higher levels of engagement or lower levels of engagement within different parts of your colleague population. So really quick example here, it's really easy. So instead of looking at different parts of the organization and talking about a 5-point or a 10 percentage point variance in engagement, immediately once you have the culture insight, you've got a much richer story, as I mentioned before, to actually understand and help people emotionally connect with what that must actually feel like, what that actually means to have a team or to have a pocket of the workforce that is slightly more engaged than others. So what we've done is segmented here by colleagues who are 75% plus so 75% favorable or higher on those typical measures of engagement: pride, advocacy, intention to stay, and motivation. And we've compared how they're talking about the culture compared to those that fall within a neutral segment, between 60 to 75 on those engagement measures, and then with the disengaged population, so for those that are under 60% favorable on the engagement measures. And what you can see immediately, it's hard not to just get that real kind of picture quickly that the colleagues who are disengaged are talking about the culture within the organization in a vastly different way. You know, the positivity of the words that they're using to talk about the culture drops from 83% that it is for engaged colleagues down to just 9% for the more disengaged group. And you start to, when you see the kind of words that they're talking about, inefficiency, favoritism, it's chaotic, they feel ignored, you really actually start to get that sense and say emotionally connect with what it must actually feel like to be in a part of the business where engagement is lower. You can also then drill down even further and actually start to get a really good understanding across your business of engagement and performance as a full picture, and really start to get down to that team level, help managers and leaders understand what's actually happening within their areas that explains some of the differences that we'll often report at that higher level. So here's a really great example here of an organization where we're looking at the 5 most engaged teams in the organization across the top, and we're looking at 5 of the least engaged teams along the bottom. And again, you could be doing this by different departments, different functions, different geographies. But when you do it at the team level, it's really powerful, because really this strips away a lot of some of the contextual variance or some of the things that we might use to explain some of the variance in engagement, particularly because these teams are doing the same role. And so to be doing the same role, but to be very different in terms of what it looks like from an engagement perspective is really interesting. But when we look at the behaviors and how they're experiencing the culture each day, you start to actually get a bit more of an understanding why, you know, the team that are more engaged are feeling valued. They are feeling that there's positivity. There's still that fun and lightheartedness in the day-to-day, a kind of balance off and mitigate against some of the long hours and the fact that it is a high-pressure environment. Whereas the less engaged teams are far more likely to be using using words in a more negative way. The long hours, how demanding the role is, suddenly becomes a negative because it's also happening within an environment of chaos and blame culture, and feeling quite confused and inefficient and being ignored, indecisive, and all of those things. So really quickly, you can start to get an understanding, not just what really explains the engagement and variance, but specifically the role and the impact that leaders and managers can have in terms of just how much they can influence the way in which their teams are experiencing culture within your organization. You can get an ED&I lens on this too. So every single practitioner on the call, I'm sure when you've had your engagement survey, you'll have had a look at, are there any differences in how colleagues feel by gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, disability, all of those different things, because naturally as practitioners, you really want to try and bridge the experience gap. You want to make sure that people have a consistently positive experience of culture within your organization. And again, having a look at how people are feeling from a sentiment perspective is useful, because you can get an example. There's an example on the left-hand side there, just having a look through the gender lens, that actually there are some differences in terms of how females perceive the organization compared to their male counterparts. And they seem to be particularly more critical of ED&I and more critical around the manager as well. But again, what you can do when you have the behavioral insight, just through that one question, is start to just unpack that a little bit more and actually see, well, what's actually happening on the day-to-day basis? What are female colleagues experiencing that explains why they're more negative about ED&I or more critical of their manager inside the organization? And immediately you can see it's because they're in an environment which they feel is far more secretive. They're in an environment which they feel is far less respectful, far less supportive, far less teamwork happening, far less caring, and far more inefficient. So just a few examples of some behaviors where the variance and what's being experienced by gender is really significant, and something that would help an organization just understand a little bit more that difference in sentiment. Okay, So that brings us on to the second part of what we can do, and hopefully that will spark a little bit of thought. And we have many of our client organizations, our customers at WorkBuzz, who are using this at the moment and really talking about the extra value that it's giving them, just how much of a richer, more pointed and more action-focused conversation they can actually have within their business off the back of using questions such as this. So a couple of examples of how you can really get into the role modeling. One is you can ask people around specific behaviors. So they might be common behaviors which we know are impactful, just generally good people management behaviors, good leadership behaviors, or they could be behaviors that you're really trying to embed inside your organization. We have lots of customers talk to us about the fact that they've launched a new behaviors framework. They're really trying to do a lot of work to embed behaviors. And so it's a really good opportunity for them to actually ask whether certain behaviors are being demonstrated well already, or whether they need to see leaders, or whether they need to see managers, whoever the target audience would be, demonstrate the behavior a little more or a lot more. And so that's one aspect of doing it. And I'll give you an example of what the data can look like if you are to run that type of question set within your research. And then the two examples on the right-hand side are what I often personally use with lots of organizations I've worked with and continue to work with, which is taking a lot of the emotion out of questions about the manager. And often we'll see that unless colleagues have a real negative perception of managers, and we see that come through the research to impact things like intention to leave, you actually find with the rating-based questions that often it'll come out as relatively low impact on engagement, and there'll be a lot of neutrality or potential false positivity in there, because it is difficult to kind of rate your manager around different things on a scale. And it's also difficult for the managers often to receive that feedback and use that feedback constructively. So what we like to do is strip a lot of that away, and just to help managers really understand what they can do to have a better impact on their team by using a far more constructive wording of the question. So we'll ask colleagues, what does your manager do a great job of? And they've got an opportunity to select a number of answers. We have quite a standard recommended set of behavioral options that we would use for something like that. And then we'll ask them the follow-up question of what would you love to see your manager do more of in the future? So really constructive, and it can be really useful in just helping a manager understand, yes, the things that they're doing really well that are really impactful, but just some really clear direction on, if you were to do more of this, it's really going to help your team from their perspective. Where it gets really interesting, and I'm going to show you some examples, is when you actually start to combine this insight with some other engagement data or other people and performance data that you've got, so that you can really pinpoint specific behaviors that are going to have a profound impact on the culture and performance of your organization. So let's have a look using the left example first. So for an example of where this can be used with your organization, immediately at one level, you can get a very quick picture of what do colleagues believe our leadership and management population are doing really well. And for this particular example, you can see towards the bottom there, lots of leaders are pretty good at just trusting colleagues to get on with their job, and they're also quite good at kind of holding colleagues accountable for their performance, and trying to connect each individual part of the organization with what the whole group is trying to do from a strategic perspective. Where more of the challenges are, and where colleagues are really kind of struggling to recognize this behavior from their leaders and managers, is around effective communication and really truly listening to colleagues. So that two-way communication piece really emphasized as being something that the organization would need to do more of and would benefit from doing more of. You can also, as I mentioned, then connect this to some other points of sentiment or people and performance measures. And so just to bring this to life for you, what we're looking at here is for a number of the different behaviors that were asked on the survey, and where we were asking colleagues whether leaders and managers demonstrate this behavior well, or whether they need to demonstrate it a little more or a lot more. What we wanted to do was to understand, how are these behaviors actually impacting the ED&I piece across the organization? So what we did was we took an average of 3 sentiment-based questions around ED&I. So, are you satisfied with the organization's efforts to improve ED&I? Do you feel treated equally fairly with respect? And do you feel like you can voice an opinion that's different from others? So some real kind of core quite traditional ED&I survey questions. What we did was we aggregated colleagues' sentiment around those and had a look at it by behaviors. And what we can see is that basically the blue line shows the average sentiment towards ED&I for those colleagues who observe their leaders and managers demonstrating all of the behaviors really well. The red line shows the average sentiment around ED&I, where colleagues feel that their leaders and managers need to demonstrate the behavior a lot more. So immediately, what you're able to do as an organization is move away from having to look at percentage points of variance in ED&I and trying to go away and explore what might be driving that and what you could do to try and improve that. You move from that to having a really clear behavioral path that can show leaders and managers specifically that if we role model these specific behaviors with consistency, people are going to feel more psychologically safe and they're going to generally be more positive about ED&I within this particular organization. And the reason that this message will land really well and it can be a powerful message is that the variance is quite significant. You know, where colleagues feel like people are open to feedback and where they feel like their leaders and managers are there for them when they're needed, where they feel like there is really good two-way communication, as we touched on the previous slide. Sometimes the variance, the improvement in how much more positive they are around the ED&I piece is 60 percentage points or more. So these behaviors really are driving sentiment around inclusion. These behaviors could make a real huge difference for that particular organization and for yourselves as practitioners. How can you get that behavioral insight that tells you what it is that you can focus on to make a huge difference? And just one piece, this is not WorkBuzz data, but just bringing in from Amy Edmondson. Again, I'm sure lots of practitioners on the call will have read or seen or heard different bits from Amy Edmondson, who's a bit of a pioneer and certainly one of the world's most influential thinkers in terms of psychological safety. I find this really fascinating, this longitudinal study of psychological safety over time that Amy Edmondson did with some colleagues, where basically what they showed was that no matter who it is that we recruit into an organization, where we bring new talent from, they will adapt to the environment that they come into from a psychological safety perspective. So blue line, if you're a new starter and you come into an organization with high departmental psychological safety, fantastic. Your own psychological safety, the psychological safety within that team is going to remain strong. That's obviously going to lead to good levels of inclusion, innovation, and all of the great things that we know psychological safety is the cornerstone of. On the flip side to that, if you come into a team that has low department psychological safety, then your own psychological safety as an individual is going to decline. And so really, as individuals coming into the organization, it's almost a matter of luck as to whether we land in a team that has a really high psychological safety that is going to bring the best out of us as individuals, or whether the opposite is going to happen. And so again, it's really important to connect this whole story together for leaders and managers so that they can understand this and understand specifically what it is they need to do, what it is that they need to role model to have the right impact within their teams. Last part, and is another kind of case study type piece on the other question that I alluded to that you could include in your survey around manager behavior, is what we looked at here is including a question around whether people have a good relationship with their line manager, but not reporting back on that, but just using it as a bit of a proxy to look at high manager advocacy versus low manager advocacy. So what we were looking at here are who are the colleagues that have a stronger relationship with their line manager, and comparing their data to those who don't have a strong relationship with their line manager. And what we were immediately able to see were a number of things. Is those who had a better relationship with their line manager were far more likely to recommend the organization as a great place to work. They were also significantly more likely to recommend the organization as a great place to shop. When we then overlaid some financial data in there, what we were also able to see is that the colleagues who had a good relationship and more respect for their line manager were also far more likely to spend more money on their own store discount card. So I think the average was around 24% per colleague that has a positive relationship with their manager. So immediately the story is there for the organization of just how influential and important the manager relationship and manager role modeling is to ensure that colleagues not only enjoy the workplace, their experience, and advocate it as a great place to work, they're also going to help bring more money in the till through what they spend themselves as colleagues, but through how they really strongly advocate the brand and recommend other people come in and do their shopping within that particular retailer. So immediately really interesting, but of course it then led us to think, well, how are people who have a stronger relationship with their manager, how are they scoring on a survey, and those typical survey items that we alluded to at the beginning, compared to those who don't have as great a relationship with their manager, and immediately see straight away that what the great managers are doing is more around the culture, the environment, the supportive environment, the positivity that they create within their team, as well as showing a really strong, authentic belief in the power of listening and acting on feedback, whether that comes from internal or external customers. So that's what we were able to see just from the survey items. When we then looked at the behaviors, where we asked, what does your manager do a great job of? What would you love to see your manager do more of? We saw a reverse trend. So for those who were strong advocates of their manager as being a great manager to work for, significantly more likely to say their manager is already doing a great job at these 5 golden behaviors. Where colleagues were less of an advocate of their manager as being a great manager to work for, they were far more likely to say that they need to see more of or want to see more of these 5 golden behaviors from their manager. So it was really painting a really clear picture for that organization that if you can get more of your managers to demonstrate these 5 behaviors with consistency, you can then start to create a potential ROI type calculation of what impact it's going to have on colleague advocacy, recommend to shop advocacy, and even financial performance, as well as some other different data points that were brought in over time as well. So for that particular organization, it gave them far more focus and direction. And what they were able to do with this is create a far more streamlined and pointed approach to coaching and developing at all different levels of management, and to really make sure that their new behavioral framework was strongly aligned to the behaviors that this data had shown them were going to be the key ones for them to work on as an organization. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, wanted to do this kind of relatively short session to just go through some bits that might spark a little bit of interest, a little bit of new thinking around how you might adopt some of this and build it into your survey. Some of the examples that I've shown you here have been looking at adding a couple of questions in, not kind of completely overhauling an approach that you already have in place with your surveys, but even outside of your more traditional survey, it could be about thinking how you do a more focused research piece on role modeling within the organization. So hopefully that's prompted some thinking. Just as you're maybe thinking about any questions, as Hayley mentioned, I'd love to try and answer some of those for you today. There was just one bit that I wanted to mention as a kind of final point here, because I'm very aware that I've spent half an hour or so talking about culture and the role that managers and leaders play, and just how important it is for them to role model certain behaviors. But what we're seeing generally from the research is that managers are struggling more with their well-being than non-managers at the moment. We see this time and time again, and we've been seeing it even more so throughout 2024 with our own customer surveys, that managers are far more likely to report risk of burnout or lower levels of well-being than their direct reports. So even though they often come out as being more engaged, they're actually reporting higher levels of daily stress, and they are struggling from a well-being perspective a little bit more than non-managers. And what we're also seeing from our data set is that managers are particularly struggling with the expectations that they have on them from a leadership level, and balancing that with the expectations they have from their direct reports to deliver operational excellence for a leadership team, particularly within a really challenging economic climate that we're all operating in at the moment. But balancing that with empowering, coaching, developing, supporting, enabling all of the people within their team as well. So really quite interesting and a big challenge for us to think about when we start to talk about role modeling with managers, because we know that where managers aren't at 100% in terms of their own well-being, that's naturally going to have an impact on how they can show up each day for their teams. So we have to really think about how we support them and how we land some of this type of insight with them to make sure that they have the confidence that this is actually going to be something that's really going to help them as managers and be more focused in some of the things that they work on and focus their development around, rather than feeling like this is another thing that is pointed at them as an expectation on them for them to do something about. So lots we can do to support leaders and managers. In summary, really important that we get better quality behavioral insight as organizations. But just that final point from a well-being perspective and a burnout risk perspective, we know that managers are really struggling. And so anything that we can do, anything that we do with them, we need to really think about how we do that most effectively with them. Okay, so back to you, Hayley. That's it from myself.
Thank you very much, Ryan. We have had a question through from Rebecca. She wanted to go back to the slide that you had up with the spider chart on, talking about the diversity and inclusion questions there.
Yeah.
So she wanted to ask whether the data shown whether their manager was male or female during the question in there. She's just thinking whether women might be more negative because their managers were male, for example, or vice versa. So she'd be interested to know if the data was broken down and whether that would make it possible if it was an anonymous survey.
Yes, we do that. Naturally, it depends on the population sizes and the number of managers that you have. But absolutely, with this particular organisation and others, what we'll do is have a look at the general number of managers by gender, and then actually have a look at what we can glean from the data about the number of people whose manager is the same gender as they are or a different gender, and not just look at it the way around that Rebecca's mentioned, but the other way around as well, and actually try to see some patterns. Absolutely, it's really we see some really quite interesting things with generational differences as well, sometimes with organizations where actually different age groups might be less positive. This is just an example. It's not always just age group, but I've seen it recently where younger age groups have been more negative in some of the survey responses around their manager. And then from the behavioral perspective, one of the things that they've been far more likely to say their manager needs to do more of is to demonstrate the time to get to know them as a person, show care for their well-being, give them regular feedback on their performance. And actually what we did, to Rebecca's point, which is why I mentioned it, we actually looked and saw that where that was happening in larger pockets, the manager was far more likely to be a manager of a much older age group. And so a lot of it was not about the individual was not wanting to be a good manager for all the people in their team, but there was maybe a bit of natural bias towards those who were more like them within their team in terms of demographic profiles. So absolutely, in short, connecting all of those dots is what really helps tell the story of what's going on culturally inside the organization.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And thanks, Rebecca, for the question. If anybody's got any more questions, Rebecca said thank you. If anybody's got any more questions, now's the last chance to ask them whilst we just tell you about some upcoming events that we've got running. WorkBuzz Live, if you are in the UK and you are free on November the 5th and you're not attending any fireworks displays, we will be hosting our flagship event down in London. So if you haven't already signed up for that, we've got a great programme put together covering a lot of the things that Ryan's covered today around generational differences, AI and well-being. So please do register and join us for that. Alternatively, we have our next webinar happening in November. Now, on the surface, you might think that's not interesting to me because it's logistics. Actually, it's the logistics director from Hovis who will be joining us to talk about how he has been engaging and retaining talent in a sector that's a bit more challenging to try and get people into, especially at a young age. So definitely worth a listen, that one. So if we don't have any more questions or any more comments, nothing left to say other than thank you again, Ryan, for your insights there. We'll share the recording with you after this if you do want to share this with your colleagues. But if you do have any further questions, you can either connect with Ryan on LinkedIn, and I'll share his details with you afterwards by email, or you can send us a message at hello@workbuzz.com. And just the anonymous attendee, thank you very much for the question. WorkBuzz Live runs from 11:30 arrival to 7 p.m. in the evening. So nice timings for you to be able to get down to London and avoid a little bit of the rush hour going home. So thank you. All right. Perfect. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.